was not a failure of mass picketing, but a failure to mass picket, in my submission. That was one of the main reasons why we didn't have the kind of breakthrough that we should have.
In the annual conference that we had, you were asking for more picketing. See, the picketing didn't fail. They didn't have enough of it. But it failed completely. Because all we had out of picketing was boys knocked about, boys arrested, and bad publicity. And we still haven't learned the lesson.
I was a bit worried as well. I mean, we started to go picketing and we went into Nottingham, and that was an experience in itself. I went 2 or 3 times. But then I asked myself, what is the point of keep going into Nottingham, you know, day after day after day, when there's no chance of getting these lads out? Because I'd looked back on the NGA dispute and seen that mass picketing, with a response from the government, bringing massive amounts of police, and yet there was no analysis going off in the leadership of, tactically, the other things that we could have done.
I think that centralised mass picketing was counterproductive. We needed many months ago to have sat back and thought then, what effect was it having? Because the state and the ruling class of Britain in military terms, and that's what we're talking about, in effect, is a military type of operation, where we take thousands of troops to a spot, they mobilise the police, and we suspect also the army, in order to defeat that. And they've had experiences at Grunwick and in Northern Ireland, and now the miners' strike that ought to teach every single worker in Britain that this tactic is not going to do anything other than, alienate public opinion from you.
Up to now, the union's been criticised on the way, really, the picketing evolved during the strike. Do you think it helped to alienate the Notts area?
I don't think it alienated. I think that those in Notts that were committed came out, and those that wanted to do a scab, they would have scabbed anyway. My own personal analysis of picketing is that Nottinghamshire wasn't picketed enough. I still believe that Notts could have been got at. It could have been picketed at. We should have concentrated more on picketing Notts, because every ton of coal turned in Notts was a ton of coal that was used against us. And I think that we could have completely isolated the Notts coalfield. I think that we hesitated and we argued and debated about Ravenscraig and Scunthorpe and Llanwern, and I personally believe that they should have been sealed as tight as a drum. And the arguments that were put forward, well-meaning and well-held beliefs that those were communities that had got to live, they were future markets for coal and all the rest of it, had to be analysed alongside whether we wanted to win this dispute or whether we were prepared to play a gentleman's game. And unfortunately, in my opinion, the decision came down that we've got to play the gentleman's game, whereas the government, their commitment to a class battle has got to be admired. Thatcher, as a class leader, is one of the finest. She knows what she wants and she's prepared to go to any lengths to do it.
The point that's been missed is this, that we talked about picketing. It's who were we picketing? We were in 72 and 74, we were all together picketing out people to stop the movement of coal. In 84, we were picketing us, our own people, our miners, and that's the very weakness of the situation, because we said that while ever the Nottinghamshire miners worked, then the rest of the working class and trade union movement will use that as an excuse not to join us, because they'll use the excuse, get them out and we'll come with you. But what we did, we concentrated on miner trying to kick another miner out. And I'm saying this, a face worker in Notts is no less a man for being a face worker in Notts than one in Yorkshire. And he's going to be just as dogmatic and just as resolute in not doing something as a Yorkshire miner. And what happened, by the way, exactly what happened, a Notts miner said, you in Yorkshire's not going to knock us out, kick us out, because that's showing weakness, physical weakness, and we're going to resist you.
In every instance, when we had the government on the run, they did something and we reacted. But we've got to mention Orgreaves, because prior to Orgreaves, you couldn't get out of the counties in South Wales. The police were blocking you. And Margaret Thatcher always kept on. She wouldn't interfere between NUM and the NCB. It's an industrial dispute. But when the information leaked out about they've instructed British Rail to settle the railwaymen's dispute, the following week, on the Monday, we had Orgreaves. And after that situation there, with all the violence, Maggie came along, we left her on the hook again, off the hook. She wouldn't give in to mob rule. She beat us every time, and we never learned a lesson out of it. We didn't condemn violence, which we should have. And this is where we lost, because like I said before, the British public, they only see violence in physical terms. But what we should have been hammering home to the public, in every instance, was the violence that the government was dishing out, because we went on strike over government violence. The closure of pits, the cutting back in the health service, education, subsidies on this and that. That's violence, but we never exploited the situation. All we allowed was the physical part to go on.
I mean, the fact is that the NUM was working with not the same sort of tools, technology and organisation that the establishment was working with. And that it was, in fact, a politically controlled mob or army that was moving around this country with the use of computerisation, in-car communication, equipment, horses, battens, crash yachts, you name it. They'd got all the tools that was necessary. And the fact that it's happened and been brought out in the open, into the open at Orgreave has politicised a lot of people. They're now sure what degree this establishment will go to keep the working class suppressed. And I'm not going to condemn the sort of violence that went on at Orgreave when it was okay for a policeman to take out a yardstick, because it was much larger than the truncheon I'd seen before, and batter somebody over the head with it, and then expect that person who's there, and I think one of the terms that's being used, it is T-shirt and jeans and sneakers on, to stand there and accept that and not react to it. It may have detracted somewhat from the case for coal, but it also had political undertones that I feel have educated many within the working class.
The real world was that we had pickets, hundreds of pickets, although we didn't have the vast majority of the men that were on strike picketing. Now that's a very important feature. If any pit had a fifth of its workers picketing, they were doing very well. And at big pits such as my own, with 2,000 and odd members, I had perhaps a tenth or just over. And what happened was the strike went on, and we'll call it a strike, but I think as it went on it became more of an endurance test for our members rather than a strike. And as the strike went on, we found that the pickets dropped to a nucleus of whatever the number was, 50% of whom were there using it as a means of making money, because it was the only income that they had. And therefore that's one of the reasons we couldn't get back down to Notts. We couldn't flood people because we didn't have the pickets to flood it with. First of all, we had a maximum army, and eventually it started to shred. And eventually we had just a nucleus, which was a very small number of the original number in the army.
I think what we've got to do is we've got to look at 72. And you've got to look who shut that power station. And it were engineers what shut that power station. But 1972 is very different to 1984. Now, let's look at Orgreave and let's look at what Arthur did. Because in Sheffield, the first 6 months of this dispute, apart from money being collected in factories, and I'm talking about AOW, Confed, look at Confed. The Confed as such never got involved in this dispute. Didn't want to, nobody, I mean, there were us, I mean, I were actively working at women's support groups, and I kept thinking, with industrial lads, all right, there were collections going on, you know, for money, but there were no miners going down to speak at factory gates. They ought to be miners. That's what miners ought to have been doing, going leafleting at workplaces in and around Sheffield. Now, it comes to Trades Council. I were on holiday at the time, and Arthur came to Sheffield Trades Council and said, Orgreave, I want you, so-and-so, to go in Sheffield and get all workplace out in Sheffield, all workplaces. But there'd been no work done prior to that to get them out. Workers weren't just going to walk out because they hadn't won them to fight. They won them to get money for kids, for food, etc. But they didn't really understand what were going off. Plus the fact that when you look in Sheffield, there's 53,000 jobs gone in steel and engineering. So where were they going to pull out? Because a lot of factories now are unorganised. So, to me, Arthur, and understood from 72 to 84, the difference in what's been happening in Britain, the deindustrialisation of Britain, because you could pull them in 72, because we were on a high in 72, weren't we? We were fighting back, and we were winning. But we haven't been sort of winning the last 2 or 3 years in Britain. We've been on a right downer, and we've had some terrible setbacks. But you know, majority of workers what are stuck in Sheffield, Nalgo, white collar section. And Nalgo, that's where they've got lads going down, lasses going down to talk, they've got miners support groups formed. A lot of sections traditionally what's not been linked with miners before. I think what we've got to realise in 85, that there's no such thing as guaranteeing that people won't walk through picket lines. Because of the changing from 70 into a new phenomenon, I think, Thatcherism.
And this, I think, you know, is a major lesson that we've got to learn. For about 150 years, Britain had a unique position in the world. For the first part of that period, we were the workshop of the world. Then, towards the close of the century, we had a massive empire, and tribute and finance flowed in. The consequences were that the ruling class and the industrialists were in an economic and financially powerful position to meet demands that were wrested from them by struggles and strikes and campaigns by the working class over that period. Because we were in a position where Britain was an industrial nation, where there was massive production taking place and industrial production was developing. And therefore, when workers went out on strike, they hit the profits of the owners of those industries. But with the advent of Thatcherism and the whole strategy that this entails, we have come into a very new situation. And that is, they represent the giant multinational corporations who operate all over the globe. Britain isn't an economic entity. They're not interested in Britain as a nationalized, as an industrialized country, particularly nationalized industries in Britain. So where they've got, and what they're planning in relation to the coal industry, where they've got coal complexes all over the world, they can afford to be without coal being produced in Britain for months and months and months, and in fact it proved to be the case. So the question of the working class and the trade union movement and labour movement in Britain thinking in terms of narrow economic and industrial struggles, of just purely and simply stopping production, stopping the flow of coal or steel or anything of this nature, I think has got to be thought about very, very seriously. Because it's no longer the way we are going to win. And that is the concept that lies behind mass picketing. It's all tied up with this whole question, and we were involved in an economic and industrial struggle which confined itself to this kind of aim and objective. The whole question of the fight for ideas, the battle of ideas, was virtually absent. So in a sense, what we were fighting is what I think was the last great 19th century battle, not just a battle that was different in 1972. We were fighting a battle with weapons and ideas and aims which really stretch back to the 19th century. And we've got to start thinking afresh, our whole approach.
Now, the first thing we've got to do, and if we don't do that, we have wasted 12 months. The first thing we've got to recognize is this, that we lost the strike, and why.
Up to August, the spirit, the fight were there. And I can remember when the negotiations got round a word, when it were all to do with one word, the principle, to me, I think the settlement ought to have been then. Now, it wasn't, but the mood changed considerably. I think people realised that it was going to be a long, hard struggle. And I think most people realised that we were going to lose. No matter how long we went out, we were on the loser. Because the demonstrations, the going out for money, for food, it were a lot harder and tougher. And that's when, actually, in September, men in Yorkshire started going back as well. Only a few, but they started to go back. It was as though, for 6 months, I think we all thought we were going to win. I think that, you know, we were going to show this government. But after Christmas, when there were, I kept saying to my husband and to some of my close friends, when's it going to all end? Where are we going? There's no there anymore. Nobody's coming up. There's no negotiations. You know, and to have to listen every Monday to when they were returned to work. And that was sad as well. There were lads who were saying, I can't, you know, because a lot of them at that time were going back because they couldn't stand it anymore. And who were I to call them a scab? I wasn't even a minor. I hadn't been out on strike 12 months. Who were me to call them a scab when they'd done it for 12 months and supported it? I've never felt as low in politics from Christmas to end and the day it ended. I mean, I was relieved that they'd said an orderly return back to work because we were breaking down in group crying. That's the pressure on us that weren't even miners' wives.
If you do analyse what happened in the strike, you know, men were dropping off the strike train as it got, you know, it was faster and faster till eventually there were only half the passengers left, well before Christmas. The strike was lost, and people should have had the courage to tell the membership that it was lost and that we ought to stop it there and then, not wait for it to end as it did. And if you cast your mind back again to October of '84, the deputies got an agreement. Now, it was not very good, and I'll be the first to agree to that. It was not very good, but at that time, I was using the argument again, that people know that I was using the argument. We ought to be taking the deputies' agreement, because it was a joint agreement with the NUM, because we'll not get out else better than that. Not that it's any good, but we're going to end up with naught if we don't take that.
And I would know that me and him were diametrically opposed at many stages during the strike. He did make reference to the NACOD's agreement. He said we'd come out with note. Well, in fact, the NACOD's agreement is note anyway. I mean, let's make it quite plain that even they now realise that it's nothing. This would have been the biggest sellout ever, because in fact it would have meant the national leadership going back totally on everything the strike had been about, because it was in effect an agreement to shut pits for other than grounds of exhaustion. Then going from that onto the way the strike finished. I was obviously disappointed. I do believe we got within our movement people who were falling for the government and the board's propaganda. I'm firmly convinced that if we would have continued the dispute, you know, victory was in sight. It was something of a letdown for myself personally and for many of the young miners that I know to go back on the premise that they was going back with their heads held high, when in fact, you know, they could have gone back in victory for the sake of another 8 to 12 weeks.
Number one, this another 6 weeks, another 12 weeks, if we trot our mind back and analyse this straight, you can go back till a month after the strike. And what we were told, we'll win this on our own. We come up into September or August, I forget what it was, and the famous words of Arthur Scargill was, General Winter will be on our side. And when General Winter came, he wasn't on our side, he was against us. The fact of the position was this, and the thing that you had to recognize immediately, the first man that went back, the strike had started to crumble. Immediately the first man went back. And when you think that Jack Taylor could get on the TV and almost begging for the NACOD's agreement, begging for it. If anyone can say that if we had stopped out another 12 weeks and won that strike, they're in cloud cuckoo land. Because a government that was prepared to sink £5 to £6.5 billion to beat the miners and then say it was a good investment, you would never crack them as we were on our own. And I think it's wrong for anyone to say that if we had stuck out another 8 or 12 weeks, we'd have won it. Never.
Paul? Yeah, I totally disagree. I happen to believe that we have to look at other things, what was happening beside what was happening in the mining industry. The pound at its lowest ebb that it's ever been, and the city starting to make rumbling noises. The fact that men had started to go back to work was not a sign in my eyes of defeat. It was a sign that men had been shoved as far as they could possibly go. And what I tend to agree with Inky, that if we could have stuck it out a bit longer, we could certainly have won. I was particularly upset prior to Christmas when we received a report from the Welsh coalfield that there were people who were talking about an organised return to work without an agreement. And we were astounded. And now you're seeing the fruits of that return to work without an agreement. The government, the coal board, and everybody else is encouraging the breakaway, the split. That is the first signs of an actual defeat for the trade union movement. We're going to be driven back 200 years.
You say, talk about staying on strike for another 12 weeks and we could have won. We were about 3 or 4 weeks begging, as Dan said, for negotiations. We couldn't even force the board and the government to negotiate with us, let alone to have from those negotiations victory. In fact, it was clear as the men were going back to work more and more in droves. And in my opinion, Adden South Wales made a decision that we would press to go back as united as we possibly could. We'd have been in a far worse position than we are now, and we're in a bad enough position as it is.
Just the strike finishing and wrapping up and us all going back to work, some with us heads down. I mean, I know we went with us heads held high on the day, but really we had us heads down, and anybody who stood with him, I mean, I would think is not really being truthful. We'd lost it, and I think the real worry is now that if we're not careful, we can lose the NUM. And I'm not. Tell you why I say that. There's no doubt in my mind that the link Prendergast breakaway is going to expand. It's going to expand because the government and the board are going to make sure it'll expand, and they'll expand it by the very fact that they'll make sure that that union has more conditions or better conditions than being in the NUM. And Jack Taylor hit on it, I think, in the EC when he said the big worry is not really that the breakaway might end up with more members than what we have. It's the worry that, in fact, some of our people will not want to be in any union at all. And that's one of the things that's been let loose from this strike. Something we never contemplated before the strike, that would ever be a non-unionist or a non-union miner. Now that's a reality. You watch it. If that doesn't happen, I'll eat my hat.
I don't believe that there is any chance of Link and Prendergast getting their majority. I think we're going to have the full weight of the media and everybody else thrown against us in order to try and persuade us different. But many men within the Nottinghamshire coalfield who worked throughout the strike and never lost a shift are saying they don't want to break away from the National Union of Mine Workers. And I believe that that loyalty can be capitalised on, and we can swing that argument in favour of retaining membership of the National Union of Mine Workers.
It's not very often I agree with Howard, but I do agree that we can't afford to be complacent on this issue. The psychology that was used by the coal board prior to and during the strike in Notts will be used in the same way to help this union. And I believe that we are going to have to vigorously campaign. The truth of the matter is that the miners returned to work with the Reds held high. They put on a brilliant display of the return to work, but on getting back there, the coal board was quick to show them that they had in fact won this dispute, and the sort of things that's happened since the return to work, where there's now talking about shutting more collieries, the loss of more jobs, they've cut across long-standing past practices and customs, and they've attacked the minorities' workplace in a terrible way, to such an extent that I think the morale in the coal industry is at the moment the lowest that it's ever been since I've worked in it.
We're worried, you know, that the coal book can close pits and reduce manpower by 20,000, 50,000. If they offered redundancy terms to the whole of the membership in the coalfield now, we'd be surprised at the numbers that would take it. We'd be halved immediately because people want to get out. And now that's one of the defeats of the strike, as I see it, one of the bad things that's come out of it. And one of the problems we had in the strike was that even our own area leadership, because I used to get involved with them in the discussion, were distressed by the fact that things were taking place at national level, in discussion between Arthur Scargill, Peter Heathfield and the board, which they were not getting fed back with. That many's the time I was told that we don't know. We know things are happening, we read it press the same as you are, but we can't get to know out. So what happened was the strike then became very centralised around Arthur Scargill and Peter Heathfield, particularly around Arthur. Now that's one of the problems that's coming out of the strike as well. We've a loss of confidence in the leadership from a lot of people. I have no confidence in Arthur's judgment anymore. And that's not, again, I'm not anti-Scargill, not anti-Arthur. I have no confidence in his judgment. I think that judgment was lacking during the dispute. And a lot of people feel the same way. That's another bad thing that's come out of the strike. We were together. Even if we had our differences in council, if we had our differences anywhere else, like Inky said, him and I always disagree just about on every point, but at the end of the day we had a discussion and we understood each other's point of view. But what's come out of the strike is that there's a very grave doubts about Arthur Scargill's ability to discuss or negotiate.
I will say myself that I come from, you know, the heart of the Dern area. There's plenty of mines, and I've had no criticism from the rank and file of the national leadership. The young, the middle, the so-called moderates within that area, if there is any, all accept that the leadership was in a position and they did the best in them circumstances. Unfortunately, we didn't get the great victory.
I'm a great believer in the fact that trade unionists, working people, miners, by and large have got the leaders that they deserve. Now, I hope that doesn't sound too cynical, but what I mean by it is that, broadly speaking, Arthur Scargill, Peter Heathfield, the executive, the South Wales area executive, the branch leaderships, are largely at the level of consciousness politically that the miners are themselves. And that even if we'd had different men, more far-sighted men, and I believe there were and are more far-sighted men, even they may have been in difficulties had they been involved with the kind of workforce that we've got in the mining industry. Because let me come back at a very local level to Dan and myself, who had sharp differences on the problems and on the way the strike was being handled, and we found it almost impossible to get our views even discussed, let alone for them to prevail, because there was no form, no organization, no movement, no conferences of a discussion and debating character that where these kind of arguments and things could have taken place. And I think that we found ourselves in the position we're in now, not just because of the kind of leaders, although that's got a certain bearing on it, but the fact that we've got a major problem about people's ideas at all levels of society. I don't think that it's clearly understood what the case for coal is, you know, amongst miners, let alone amongst the rest of the British trade union movement. And this is absolutely imperative that we get this across, because far too many people who even supported the miners during the year-long strike had a kind of a queasy feeling that somehow we were campaigning and struggling for an historically outdated energy fuel and a commodity, you know, that really had had its day.
Now, in regard to what the union could have done, yes, they could have campaigned. They could have explained to the public that it wasn't a case for the miners, it wasn't victory for the miners. It was a case of victory for common sense for the whole of the country. That with the coal industry being cut down, you'd have to get that fuel from elsewhere. But in regard to putting this case over, at no time of any of our officials, and I'm talking about the whole of the National Executive now, not just one man, I'm talking about the National Executive, the time they'd had on the media, they never put the case for coal across. The case was there to put across. for a start, to gain support for the miners, there was only 4 million unemployed to start with that we should have had back in ourselves. We had the Greenpeace women. There's not a bigger movement out, I don't think, in this country than against nuclear energy. But we had the churches, and in this strike, that's the first time, I think, in the history of trade unionism, that the churches have come down on the side of the working class. Normally, they've always been on the side of the establishment. But when they came along, the leadership of this union didn't want to know. They were going to win it on their own.
But there's been no conception of campaigning right throughout the strike from the leaders in the sense of an offensive thing. It was always defensive. They didn't see any need for alliances, you know, and building up movements. And they had no conception of winning public opinion. That's what I believe. If we remained as we did on the defensive, reacting to what the government were doing, sequestration of our funds, the violence and knocking our blokes over the head and arresting them and jailing them on the picket lines, the fact that they conducted the struggle and the argument publicly on the terms of the government and not what we thought should have been raised and argued about. I'll tell you, the NUM had a marvellous campaign pack, the case for coal, campaign for coal, produced in 1982. 7 pamphlets, tremendous stuff on nuclear power, on the new uses of coal, various things of that nature. It might as well, as far as the strike was concerned, not have been in existence.
The one of the things that beat us, it's the establishment. The establishment owned the press, the television, and all the facts and figures. If any of our members went into the studios to discuss any aspect of the dispute, you were only asked questions, it was the violence part. Now, we never had the opportunity to put the plan for coal over, why there should be a coal industry, why is coal better than nuclear power, how many jobs would be lost if jobs were lost in the coal industry. We never had the opportunity to do it.
I mean, I happen to agree totally with Derek that the media, you know, was devastating as far as the miners were concerned, because they indeed chased sensationalism and they indeed brought the violence out in a manner that formed the opinions of this vast majority of the public that our friends spoke about. If a person holds an opinion, it has got to be formed somehow. And the thing that forms his opinion is the media in general.
In fact, the media, I don't think, were as bad as we painted out to be. There were sympathetic programs that came out to the miners, done entirely by the media. And I don't agree with Derek, I've got to be honest, with the fact that we weren't allowed to put out case for coal. I'm not arguing that the media were all, you know, all falling over themselves to help us. That isn't my standpoint at all. But I think it's oversimplifying things to say that it wasn't possible to do a lot more than we did with the media. There was a program early on in the strike in South Wales called Week In and Week Out. And they had lodge officers there and various other people, councillors and people who were hostile to the strike and that. And it was a fairly free-for-all type of discussion. And the miners who took part in that program did not have a clue as to what this strike was really about. And they were getting themselves involved in all kinds of arguments about this violence on the picket lines and things of this nature, which were effects, not the causes of the strike. And talking about what, if you couldn't win, if you found yourself you couldn't win, what would you do? Flood the pits. We were on strike in order to defend jobs and our industry, and that was their response to that kind of a question. Did they deal with nuclear questions? No, they didn't. Did they deal with the new uses of coal? No, they didn't. Now, I'm not in any shape or form denigrating the courage and the tenacity and the determination of the miners who were on strike. What I am trying to raise here is the fact that we have a real problem of understanding.
one of the problems in Yorkshire was that they got funds readily available, and South Wales had got funds readily available, and Kent had. And so they sat on the funds and used them as they saw fit. Within Nottinghamshire, of course, we hadn't got a halfpenny. We couldn't get at the money box. And one of the first things we had to do was, besides trying to man picket lines up, was to send people out to places like Norwich and Basingstoke. Whoever heard of Basingstoke? But within a few weeks of that strike starting, we'd got a support committee in there that was bringing hundreds and hundreds of pounds out per week. And people stood in shopping precincts in Basingstoke were having a miner shoved up under the nose.
It created bonds between sections of the working and professional classes that had never been there before, where in fact you'd got miners readily making contact with, mixing with and speaking to groups of university teachers, students, doctors, school teachers, many of the white-collar professions that the miners always thought, you know, wasn't really with them.
It was vital that women got involved and people, the community, were aware of what this government was trying to do, because to me it wasn't just enough for the miners to just go on strike and do it themselves. We were fighting for the pits, and they're ours, they belong to us, they belong to the people. But the amount of women that turned up, I mean, I've never been involved in anything like it. The first meeting there were 50, the second meeting there were over 100. We couldn't get them all in the centre. People wanted to help. We developed as women. We'd come from all different backgrounds, lasses who didn't even know trade union movement, feminists, lasses in different political parties, unemployed women. And I saw the Women Against Pit Closure movement as bringing the women's movement together, making it whole, making it representative of all women.
I don't think the miners as a body were fully aware, or even hardly aware, of the significance of the development of the women's groups. And I think that we've got to understand this is one of the positive pluses of the strike. And if we don't, we will betray our own manhood just as much as we will be betraying the women. If we don't understand this, then our struggle is going to be set back.
One of the things that we were concerned about when we could see the strike looming on the horizon was that we were concerned about our youngsters. They'd never gone through 72 and 74, and youngsters today, you know what they're interested in: pot, sex and pop records, and that's it. And we had fears that the young people would be the ones that let us down, even though the fight was for their jobs. But lo and behold, the gauntlet was thrown down and they picked it up. And nobody will be able to deny that certainly the young miners of today carried the standards of their forefathers and are beyond criticism.
The things you've just been discussing, I believe that's the two good points that came out of the strike, was the women's support groups and the role that the women played in the strike, plus the fact that the amount of youngsters that would stand up in meetings and speak, boys that would never think about it before, and their whole outlook have changed. But what have got to happen is this, that this enthusiasm now and this interest have got to be channeled properly, not played with. They've got to be used. And the boys, they've got a lot to learn. And people have got to teach them. And then we'll have intelligent leadership out of these youngsters in later years. I believe they'll stand up to anything that can be thrown at them. Because I think that sticking 12 months of a strike, they can stick that, they can stick anything.
I think that one of the things, and it is really a positive, one of the things is that the awareness and the experience they've had will not be restricted to the coal industry or even to the NUM, as they go through life in much the same way as many people here sat on the granddad's knees or listen to the fathers. described the 1926 strike. You know, and it was kept, part of the miners' tradition, kept alive in the minds of the people who didn't experience it. And I think that this will go on traditionally through the families. They'll be proud of the fact that they stood up and fought. And they'll tell the children and the grandchildren that. And I believe that wherever they finish up or whatever they finish up doing, if the coal industry is decimated at Endett Road, it doesn't matter what sort of work they go in, I think they'll always be pro-union. They've realised which side they're on.
In any place where you're in conversation, politics is a very prominent topic, whereas before this dispute and before the Thatcher government, politics were a very taboo area, that people are aware that politics means something. It's not just a bunch of hooligans in House of Commons that shouting at each other. There's a feeling. They've all been made aware of that feeling in this dispute. They've all experienced the hardship. They've all experienced the struggle. And I think in the not too distant future, our members will be asked to try again, to try and save the industry.
You can't expect the miners to lead or initiate in this immediate situation any fight back, but for the two reasons. First of all, there is a mood of resignation at present amongst the miners, you know. They feel impotent, that they can't stop what's happening. And I think this partly arises from the fact that we are refusing officially as an NUM to recognise that it was a defeat in terms of stopping that immediate pit closure programme. But secondly, I think that we shouldn't expect the miners to develop this kind of struggle and campaign, because I don't think that the miners really understood the kind of struggle we were in. And therefore, outside organisations, broad coalitions of trade unions, church people, local authorities have got to get together and work out a programme of action and campaign around these ideas in order to develop a political movement in Britain that will include and bring in the miners in order to really begin to halt what the government has got in mind for the coal mining industry and indeed for the whole of British industry.
I don't think it's a defeat, the 12 months. I think it's a step back. I wouldn't say it were a defeat, because to strike for 12 months, you know, to stick together for 12 months, I think that's a tremendous achievement. And the developments within that, and the friends that the miners have made within that 12 months, the peace women, the tremendous support from abroad, the churches, etc. And I think that's something that we can build on. And it's like when the next one comes along, and I'm not saying it's miners, and another dispute, then we've got to look at industrial action with much more community involvement, because I think that's the only way in the 80s that we're going to win disputes in Britain.